The look on James's face when his boss introduced me as the new majority shareholder was absolutely priceless. Standing there in the boardroom, his complexion draining of color as I took my seat at the head of the table, the same man who had emptied our joint accounts just weeks earlier, thinking I'd be left broken and helpless while he built a new life with his affair partner. What he didn't know was that I'd been quietly building an emergency fund for years, one that would eventually allow me to purchase controlling interest in the very company where he'd worked his entire career. I still remember the exact moment when I decided to take control of my financial future. We had been married for 8 years, and James had always insisted on managing our finances. "Don't worry your pretty head about these complicated matters," he'd say with that condescending smile that I once found endearing, but now recognize as the first warning sign I should have heeded. While he believed I was focused solely on my modest graphic design business, I was actually building a substantial portfolio of investments on the side, preparing for a day I hoped would never come. But deep down, I knew might. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The catalyst for everything happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I was working on designs for a new client when I received an unusual email notification from our bank. Unusual activity alert, large transfer processed. My heart raced as I logged into our joint account, only to discover that James had transferred nearly all of our savings, $285,000, to an account I didn't recognize. Just below that transaction was another one, a first-class flight booking to Bali, scheduled for the following week. For a moment, I sat frozen at my desk, the implications washing over me in waves of disbelief and betrayal. 8 years of marriage? And this was how it would end? With my husband stealing our joint savings and fleeing to a tropical paradise? I took a deep breath, my hands shaking as I picked up my phone. But instead of calling James, I called someone else, my private financial advisor, Melissa. "It's happened," I said simply when she answered. "I need to activate our contingency plan." 3 years earlier, I had begun working with Melissa after landing a significant design contract that paid considerably more than James knew about. Rather than adding this money to our joint accounts, I had opened a separate investment portfolio, building what Melissa called my Freedom Fund. At the time, I'd felt guilty about the secrecy, but something in me knew it was necessary. A survival instinct I couldn't quite explain until this very moment. "How much did he take?" Melissa asked, her voice calm and professional. "Almost everything from the joint accounts, about $285,000. "And how much do you have in your private portfolio now?" I could hear keyboard clicks as she pulled up my information. "After the last tech investment matured, just over $1.2 million, she informed me. The number still shocked me every time I heard it. While James thought I was earning a modest income from my design clients, I had actually built a reputation as one of the top UX designers in the industry, commanding premium rates that I'd carefully hidden from my controlling husband. "What do you want to do?" Melissa asked after a moment of silence. That's when an idea began to form, one so audacious that it almost made me laugh. For years, James had worked at Meridian Technologies, rising through the ranks to Senior Vice President of Operations. He frequently boasted about the company's success, but complained that the founder, Richard Morgan, refused to sell even a small stake of the business to executives like him. What James didn't know was that Richard had been one of my anonymous design clients for the past 2 years, and we had developed a friendship beyond our professional relationship. "I need you to find out if Meridian Technologies is open to outside investors," I told Melissa. And I need to know before James gets on that plane to Bali. The next 48 hours were a blur of activity, while James continued his normal routine, coming home late with thinly veiled excuses about project deadlines. I was laying the groundwork for the most significant financial decision of my life. Melissa confirmed what I had suspected. Richard Morgan was indeed looking for a silent partner to buy a significant stake in Meridian Technologies. But he wanted someone he could trust, not just a faceless investor. I arranged a meeting with Richard under the pretense of discussing a new design project. When I arrived at his office, his assistant ushered me directly into the conference room rather than his usual office. "Victoria," Richard greeted me warmly, standing as I entered. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." "Thank you for seeing me, Richard," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "Your message suggested this wasn't about our usual design work," he said, gesturing for me to take a seat. I took a deep breath. "No, it's not. I understand you're looking for an investor, and I'd like to discuss the possibility of purchasing a stake in Meridian Technologies." Richard's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "You're interested in investing? I had no idea you were in a position to consider something of this magnitude." "Most people don't," I replied with a small smile, "including my husband." Richard's expression shifted slightly at the mention of James. "Ah, yes. James has been with us for 12 years now? He's mentioned your design work a few times, though he described it as—" He hesitated. "As a cute little hobby?" I finished for him. "A way to keep myself busy while he handles the important work?" Richard had the grace to look embarrassed. "Something like that, yes." "It's a perception I've allowed to persist," I admitted. "But the reality is quite different." Over the next hour, I laid out my financial position, showing Richard the portfolio I had built independently over the years. His surprise gradually gave way to respect, and by the end of our meeting, we had outlined the framework for a deal. I would purchase a 51% stake in Meridian Technologies, becoming the majority shareholder while Richard remained as CEO. "Are you sure about this?" Richard asked as we finalized the details. "It's going to cause quite a stir when it's announced, especially with James." "I'm counting on it," I replied, my resolve strengthening with each passing moment. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. The paperwork for my investment was completed the day before James was scheduled to leave for Bali. That evening, he came home earlier than usual, bringing my favorite wine and takeout from the expensive Italian restaurant we reserved for special occasions. "I have some news," he said, pouring the wine with an unusual attentiveness. "I've been offered a consulting opportunity overseas. It's a short-term project, but it could lead to something more permanent." I watched him carefully, noting the way he avoided direct eye contact, a tell he had whenever he was lying. "That sounds exciting," I said, taking a sip of wine. "When would you leave?" "That's the thing," he replied, his expression carefully constructed to appear regretful. "It's very last minute. I'd need to fly out tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" I repeated, feigning surprise. "That is sudden. How long will you be gone?" "A few weeks, maybe a month," he said vaguely. "We can talk every day, of course, and the money is too good to pass up." I wondered how he would explain disappearing with our life savings, but apparently he had planned for that too. "I've had to move some funds around for expenses while I'm there," he continued. "The company will reimburse me, of course, but they needed me to handle the upfront costs." The audacity was breathtaking. Not only was he planning to abandon me, but he was creating an elaborate lie to explain the missing money, probably assuming I rarely checked our accounts and wouldn't notice until he was safely out of the country. "I'm so proud of you," I said, raising my glass in a toast to new opportunities. The relief on his face was palpable. "To new opportunities," he echoed, clinking his glass against mine. Little did he know the new opportunity I was toasting was my own, not his. The next morning, James kissed me goodbye with promises to call when he landed. I smiled and waved from the doorway as his taxi pulled away, heading not to the airport as he thought, but to the most important meeting of my life. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The executive boardroom at Meridian Technologies was intimidating by design. All dark wood, leather, chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. As Richard had requested, all senior executives were present for the special announcement, including James, who did a double take when I walked in behind Richard. "Victoria?" The confusion on his face was almost comical. "What are you doing?" "Here? I thought you had a client meeting this morning." Before I could respond, Richard called the room to attention. "Thank you all for being here on such short notice. I've gathered you today to announce a significant change in Meridian's ownership structure." The room fell silent, all eyes on Richard except for James's, which remained fixed on me with growing suspicion. "As you know, I've been considering bringing on a strategic partner for some time," Richard continued. "Someone who understands our vision and can help take Meridian to the next level. I'm pleased to announce that as of 9 a.m. this morning, Victoria Bennett has acquired a majority stake in Meridian Technologies." The silence in the room deepened for a beat before erupting into murmurs of surprise. James's face went through a remarkable transformation, confusion giving way to disbelief, then to horror as the implications sank in. "Victoria will be taking on the role of chairperson of the board, working closely with me on strategic initiatives," Richard explained, gesturing for me to join him at the head of the table. As I took my seat, I finally met James's gaze directly across the polished mahogany. "I believe you were headed to the airport," I said, just loudly enough for him to hear over the continued murmurs of the executives. "Bali, wasn't it?" The color drained from his face as he realized I knew everything: the affair, the stolen money, the planned escape. And worse, that his wife, whom he had dismissed as financially naive for years, was now effectively his boss. The meeting continued, but James seemed unable to process anything being said. When Richard opened the floor for questions, one of the other executives asked the question James couldn't seem to formulate. "How is Victoria qualified to take on such a significant role? No offense," he added hastily in my direction. Before Richard could defend me, I leaned forward. "That's a fair question, Michael. While many of you know me only as James's wife, I've actually been running my own successful design firm for the past decade, with clients including several Fortune 500 companies. I deliberately didn't mention that Meridian had been one of those clients, knowing it would further erode James's credibility. Additionally, I hold an MBA from Wharton and previously worked in venture capital before starting my own business." The revelation sent another ripple of surprise through the room. James looked as though he might be sick. As the meeting concluded, executives came forward to introduce themselves properly, many for the first time, despite years of company. Holiday parties where I had been present but largely ignored as James's wife. James remained rooted to his chair, his planned escape to Bali now impossible. When we were finally alone in the boardroom, James found his voice. "How could you do this?" he demanded, his tone oscillating between anger and shock. "This was my company." "No, James," I corrected him calmly. "This was Richard's company. Now it's primarily mine. And as for how I could do this, perhaps you should be asking yourself the same question about emptying our accounts and booking a one-way ticket to Bali with." I consulted my phone as if checking a note, though I knew the name by heart. As Sophia from accounting. "You don't understand," he began, his hands spreading in a placating gesture I had seen too many times before. "The money, I was investing it for us, and Sophia is just a colleague who—" "James," I interrupted, "let's not insult each other's intelligence. I have copies of your text messages, the transfer details, everything. The question now is not what you did, but what happens next." His expression shifted again, calculation replacing desperation as he realized there might still be a way to benefit from the situation. "We could run this company together," he suggested, his tone softening. "With your ownership and my experience, we'd be unstoppable." I almost admired his ability to pivot so quickly. "That's an interesting proposition," I said, gathering my papers. "Unfortunately, there's the small matter of the $285,000 you transferred, out of our joint account. I'll need that returned immediately." "Of course," he agreed too quickly. "That was just a misunderstanding. I can transfer it back today." "Good," I nodded, "because your employment here depends on it." His relief was visible but short-lived as I continued. "However, your position will be changing. Richard and I agree that your talents might be better utilized in our new office." "New office?" he repeated uncertainly. "Yes, we're expanding. To serve clients in a developing market. The Singapore branch will need experienced leadership." The irony wasn't lost on him. Singapore was less than a 2-hour flight from Bali. He would be going to Southeast Asia after all, just not in the way he had planned, and certainly not with Sophia. "The alternative, of course," I added, standing, "to leave, is that I could press charges for financial fraud, given that the money you transferred was largely my earnings that I had contributed to our joint accounts." The choice was clear, and James knew it. His dream of escaping with his affair partner and our life savings had transformed into a corporate exile under his wife's authority. As I walked out of the boardroom, Richard fell into step beside me. "That was impressive," he said quietly. "Ruthless, but impressive." "Not ruthless," I corrected him. "Just finally standing up for myself after years of being underestimated. And speaking of which, I'd like to review the design department's budget. I have some ideas for expansion." Richard smiled. "Of course, Mrs. Chairperson. Your wish is my command." The weeks that followed were transformative. With James relocated to Singapore, alone as Sophia had quickly lost interest when the money disappeared and the Bali plans fell through, I settled into my new role at Meridian with surprising ease. The executives who had initially been skeptical of my sudden appearance in the boardroom soon came to respect my business acumen and fresh perspective on the company's challenges. I decided to maintain my separate design business rather than fold it into Meridian, preserving the independence that had been my financial salvation. The story of how I came to own the company remained private between Richard, James, and me, at least officially. Unofficially, the corporate grapevine ensured that an embellished version spread through the company, transforming me from an unknown entity to a near-mythical figure who had outsmarted the architect of her own betrayal. 3 months after taking control of Meridian, I received a late-night email from James. The Singapore office was performing well under his leadership, perhaps the only arena where his competence matched his confidence, but his personal life had collapsed around him. The email was part apology, part plea for reconciliation, suggesting that our shared success could form the foundation for a new beginning. I read it twice before composing my response. I'm pleased with your professional performance and the ESI growth of the Singapore office. Let's keep our communication focused on business matters moving forward. Your quarterly review is scheduled for next month. Hitting send, I felt no satisfaction or vindication, only a peaceful certainty that I had finally broken the cycle of manipulation that had characterized our marriage. The money James had attempted to steal had been returned to my personal accounts, rather than our joint holdings, and divorce proceedings were moving forward without drama or conflict. He had signed the papers without negotiation, aware that his position at Meridian hung in the balance. 2 years have passed since that pivotal day in the boardroom. Meridian Technologies has flourished under the joint leadership that Richard and I provide, with profits increasing by over 30% and employee satisfaction at an all-time high. The design division I established has become one of our most profitable segments, attracting top talent and prestigious clients. James continues to run the Singapore office effectively, our interactions now limited to quarterly business reviews and the occasional executive retreat. The awkwardness has faded into a professional detachment that serves both the company and our separate personal lives. Sometimes I catch him looking at me during video conferences with an expression I can't quite decipher. Perhaps regret, perhaps simply wonder at how thoroughly he had misjudged the woman he had married. As for me, the experience transformed, not just my financial situation, but my entire approach to life. The silent strength I had cultivated out of necessity became a confident voice in the boardroom, in my personal relationships, and in the women's business mentorship program I founded. With a portion of my Meridian dividends, the greatest lesson wasn't about money or power or even justice. It was about recognizing my own worth after years of allowing someone else to define it for me. The emergency fund I had built in secret became much more than financial security. It became the foundation for a life where I would never again need to make myself smaller to accommodate someone else's ego. Today, when aspiring entrepreneurs ask me for advice, particularly women leaving controlling relationships, I tell them this. Your financial independence is not just about survival, it's about having the freedom to write your own story, even when others try to erase you from the narrative. The money James attempted to steal would have sustained him for perhaps a year or two in his new life. The empire I built in silence has secured my future for a lifetime, and more importantly, has created opportunities for others to secure theirs. Sometimes the most powerful response to betrayal isn't confrontation or revenge, but simply revealing the strength that was there all along, hidden in plain sight from those too arrogant to recognize it. In the end, James didn't lose me because he fell in love with someone else. He lost me because he never truly saw me at all, until it was too late, and I was sitting at the head of the table, holding all the power he had assumed was his alone. If this story resonates with you, remember that your worth is not determined by how others see you, but by how clearly you see yourself. Building your financial security isn't selfish, it's necessary. And sometimes, the quietest revolutions are the ones that change everything. Let me know in the comments if you've ever been underestimated and how you proved your doubters wrong. And don't forget to subscribe. Next week, I'll be sharing the 5 financial strategies that helped me build my emergency fund without raising suspicion in a controlling relationship. Your freedom may depend on it. The morning after the boardroom. Revelation. I awoke to a storm of text messages from James. They ranged from desperate apologies to angry accusations, culminating in a final plea. Please don't do this to me. My reputation at Meridian is everything. I sat on the edge of my bed, phone in hand, contemplating how quickly the power dynamic had shifted between us. For years, I had been the one seeking his approval, carefully managing his moods, and making myself smaller to fit into the box he had created for me. Now, with a single business transaction, our roles had reversed completely. Rather than responding immediately, I got ready for my first official day as chairperson of Meridian Technologies. I selected a deep blue suit I had purchased months ago but never worn. James had commented that it looked too executive for a freelance designer. The irony wasn't lost on me as I fastened the buttons and checked my reflection. The woman staring back at me wasn't just dressed differently. She carried herself with a confidence that had been dormant for too long. As I drove to the office, I considered the practical implications of my new position. Most of the senior leadership team had been with Meridian for years, many hired by James himself. Would they respect my authority, or see me as an interloper who had somehow manipulated her way into ownership? The uncertainty created a flutter of anxiety in my stomach, but I pushed it aside. I hadn't come this far to be undermined by self-doubt. Richard was waiting in the lobby when I arrived, his familiar presence a welcome anchor in these uncharted waters. "Good morning, Chairperson," he said with a warm smile that eased some of my tension. "Ready for your first day?" "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, returning his smile. "How's the mood upstairs?" "Curious," he admitted as we walked toward the elevator. "There are a lot of questions about yesterday's announcement, especially with James noticeably absent today. Has he been in contact with anyone here?" I asked, thinking of the barrage of messages on my phone. "He called me first thing this morning," Richard said, pressing the button for the executive floor. "Tried to convince me I was making a terrible mistake. When that didn't work, he suggested that you were emotionally unstable and making financial decisions out of spite. I couldn't help but laugh at the predictability of it. And your response?" I told him that in the 10 years I've known him, he's never once mentioned that his wife has an MBA from Wharton or runs a design firm with clients that would make our marketing department weep with envy. The elevator doors opened to the executive floor as he finished. In fact, I said it seems he's the one who might have been emotionally compromised, given how thoroughly he misrepresented his own wife's capabilities. The executive floor was unusually quiet as we made our way to the conference room where Richard had scheduled a leadership meeting. Conversations paused as we passed, eyes following our progress with barely concealed curiosity. I recognized the scrutiny for what it was: not just assessment of the new boss, but recalibration of everything they thought they knew about James Bennett's wife. The senior leadership team was already assembled when we entered. Chief Financial Officer Elena Rodriguez, Chief Technology Officer Marcus Kim, Chief Marketing Officer Diana Patel, and Head of Legal Counsel Jonathan Wright. These were people I had met at company events over the years, always introduced as James's wife, and then promptly forgotten as the conversation turned to business matters from which I was excluded. "Good morning," I said, taking my place at the head of the table beside Richard. "Thank you all for adjusting your schedules for this meeting." "Of course, Mrs. Bennett," Elena responded, her tone professional but guarded. "We're all very eager to understand these unexpected changes." I noted her deliberate use of my married name rather than my title, a subtle but clear indication of how she still viewed me. I understand there must be questions, I acknowledged. And please, call me Victoria, or Chairperson Bennett if we're being formal. The slight emphasis on my title wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Richard took the lead, explaining the financial structure of my investment and outlining the new organizational chart. James would be transitioning to head the Singapore office, a revelation that caused visible surprise among the executives who had apparently not been informed of this development. Singapore? Marcus repeated. But the Singapore expansion wasn't scheduled to begin for another 6 months. We've accelerated the timeline, Richard explained smoothly. James has expressed interest in the international side of the business for some time, and this opportunity aligned with our strategic goals. It was a generous reframing of what was essentially a corporate exile, and I appreciated Richard's discretion. The less the team knew about the personal circumstances behind these changes, the easier it would be to establish my authority based on merit rather than drama. I'd like to address what I'm sure is on everyone's mind, I said, drawing their attention back to me. My qualifications for this position. While many of you know me only as James's wife, my professional background is actually quite relevant to Meridian's future. Over the next 20 minutes, I outlined my education, my experience in venture capital, and the growth of my design firm over the past decade. I shared specific examples of successful projects, strategic pivots, and financial decisions that demonstrated my business acumen. As I spoke, I could see the initial skepticism in their expressions gradually giving way to reluctant respect. Additionally, I concluded, I've been familiar with Meridian's operations for years, not just through James, but as one of your clients. This revelation caused another stir around the table. My firm has been working with Richard on the UX redesign of your enterprise software suite for the past 2 years. The project codenamed Phoenix is actually my team's work. Diana's eyes widened at this. Phoenix is your design? That's our most successful product launch in 5 years. Yes, Richard confirmed. Victoria's team was behind the entire user experience redesign that our clients have been raving about. She insisted on remaining anonymous on the project at the time, for reasons that perhaps make more sense now. The atmosphere in the room shifted perceptibly as the team reconciled their preconceptions with this new information. By the end of the meeting, the initial resistance had largely dissipated, replaced by a cautious openness to the new direction. As the executives filed out, Elena lingered behind. I have a confession to make, she said when we were alone. I knew who you were before today. I mean your professional reputation. I recognized your firm's work on Phoenix immediately. My sister works in UX design and practically worships your case studies. I was surprised by this admission. You never mentioned it at any of the company events. James made it clear that you preferred to keep your work separate from his professional life, she explained, looking somewhat embarrassed now. He said you were sensitive about living in his shadow at Meridian, so we all respectfully avoided the topic. The calculated manipulation of this lie took my breath away. James had actively constructed a narrative that ensured no one at his company would ever recognize or acknowledge my professional accomplishments. It wasn't just that he had failed to see me. He had deliberately obscured me from others' view, as well. That was considerate of you, I managed to say, keeping my tone neutral. But as you can see, quite unnecessary. In fact, I'm looking forward to bringing my design perspective to Meridian's executive decisions moving forward. Elena nodded, offering a genuine smile for the first time. For what it's worth, I'm actually relieved. The company needs fresh thinking, especially with the challenges we're facing in the market right now. As she left, I remained seated, processing this new information. How many other interactions had been shaped by James's careful management of my image? How many connections or opportunities had been deliberately redirected away from me to maintain the fiction of his superior position in our marriage? Richard returned, interrupting my thoughts. That went better than expected, he observed, taking a seat beside me. Though I suspect the real test will be in the weeks ahead. What do you mean? I asked, though I had my suspicions. James has built strong loyalties here over the years, Richard explained. Not everyone will adapt to this transition as quickly as Elena seems to be doing. And honestly, some may actively resist. You think he'll try to undermine me remotely? The possibility didn't surprise me, given what I now understood about James's character. I think, Richard said carefully, that James has spent years building a certain image of himself at this company, and by extension, a certain image of you. Disrupting that narrative threatens more than just his pride. It threatens his identity. People rarely surrender that without a fight. He was right, of course. The text messages still unanswered on my phone were evidence enough of James's unwillingness to accept our new reality. And if he was frantically messaging me, I could only imagine the calls he was making to his allies within the company. So, what's your advice? I asked, appreciating Richard's frankness. Be exactly who you are, he said simply. Your qualifications speak for themselves. Your vision for the company is compelling. Don't get distracted trying to manage James's reaction or anyone else's perception. Focus on doing the job you're eminently qualified to do. It was sound advice, reminiscent of what my mother had told me years ago when I was struggling with confidence in graduate school. Competence doesn't need to announce itself. It simply needs to be consistently demonstrated. The next few weeks proved Richard's prediction correct. While most of the executive team quickly adjusted to my leadership, pockets of resistance emerged throughout the company. Projects I initiated faced subtle delays. Suggestions I made in meetings were politely acknowledged, then quietly shelved. Information I requested arrived incomplete or late, always with plausible excuses about systems or scheduling conflicts. None of it was overt enough to address directly without seeming paranoid, but the pattern was clear. James might be physically in Singapore, but his influence remained firmly embedded in Meridian's culture. The James way of doing things had become so institutionalized that any deviation was treated with inherent suspicion. The breaking point came during a quarterly review of the product development pipeline. Marcus presented a roadmap that completely overlooked the design improvements I had proposed the previous month. I noticed the Phoenix 2.0 updates aren't included here, I observed, keeping my tone neutral. Was there a reason those were deprioritized? Marcus exchanged a quick glance with another team member before responding. We received some feedback from the Singapore office suggesting those changes might not align with our core users' expectations. From the Singapore office, I repeated carefully. You mean from James? Well, yes, Marcus admitted. He's been handling our largest enterprise clients for years, so we generally defer to his judgment on user preferences. The room fell, silent as everyone absorbed the implicit challenge. This wasn't just about a product roadmap, it was about whose authority would prevail. James had clearly been communicating with his former team, countermanding my directives from halfway around the world. If I let this pass, my credibility would be permanently undermined. I closed my laptop slowly, choosing my words with care. I appreciate James's experience with our enterprise clients. However, the Phoenix 2.0 redesign is based on extensive user research conducted by my team over the past 6 months. Research that James hasn't been privy to since he's been focused on the Singapore launch. I turned to Richard. Would you pull up the user testing results we reviewed last week? Richard, understanding exactly what I was doing, quickly projected the comprehensive analysis onto the main screen. The data clearly showed the positive response to the proposed design changes, with metrics significantly better than our current interface across all user groups. Additionally, I continued, 3 of our 5 largest enterprise clients have specifically requested improvements to exactly the pain points these updates address. Their renewal decisions next quarter will be heavily influenced by our response to those requests. The room was completely silent now, all eyes on the compelling data illuminating the screen. So, I concluded, my voice firm but not unkind, while I value input from all our offices, including Singapore, decisions about our product roadmap will be based on data and direct client feedback, not personal preferences or past practices. The Phoenix 2.0 updates will proceed as scheduled. Are there any questions? There were none. The attempted end run around my authority had been decisively blocked, without direct confrontation or drama. More importantly, I had established not just that my decisions would stand, but that they were backed by solid business reasoning that prioritized client needs and company growth. After the meeting, Richard stayed behind, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Well handled, he said simply. It had to be done, I replied, gathering my materials. Though I suspect this won't be the last attempt. No, he agreed. But each one will be less effective than the last. James's influence here is already waning. People respect results, Victoria. Show them those, and loyalty shifts surprisingly quickly. That evening, I finally responded to James's accumulated messages with a single professional email. James, I understand you've been in contact with the product development team regarding Phoenix 2.0. While I value your experience with our enterprise clients, I've established a clear decision-making protocol for product updates that relies on current user research and direct client feedback. Going forward, please direct all product suggestions through the appropriate channels, beginning with Marcus, who will bring them to the executive committee for consideration. This will ensure our decisions remain transparent and data-driven, rather than creating confusion about leadership directives. I'm looking forward to your Q1 results from Singapore. The preliminary numbers look promising. Regards, Victoria Bennett, Chairperson, Meridian Technologies. His response came within minutes, the carefully professional tone barely masking his frustration. Victoria, I was simply sharing insights based on my decade of experience with these clients. The Singapore office's success is directly tied to maintaining consistency with the products our enterprise customers rely on. Perhaps we could discuss this on a call. These matters are better handled through direct conversation rather than email. James, I recognize the request for what it was. An attempt to move our communication to a channel where he could employ the emotional manipulation that had been effective throughout our marriage. The charm, the subtle guilt trips, the implied disappointment that had so often led me to defer to his judgment. James, I appreciate your concern for consistency. The user research indicates these updates will actually improve consistency across our product suite while addressing key pain points identified by the clients themselves. My schedule is quite full with the Q2 planning meetings, but Marcus has all the relevant data and can address any specific concerns about impact on the Singapore office operations. Regards, Victoria. No offer of a call. No apology for countermanding his directions. Just a clear, professional reinforcement of the new power structure. He didn't respond. 3 days later, Elena approached me after our regular financial review. "I thought you should know," she said, her expression concerned. "James has been reaching out to several people on my team, requesting detailed reports on your investment structure and the terms of your purchase agreement with Richard." This didn't surprise me, though I appreciated Elena's loyalty in bringing it to my attention. "Thank you for letting me know. Did your team provide the information?" "No," she said firmly. "Those documents are confidential at the executive level." I reminded them of our disclosure policies. She hesitated before adding, "He wasn't pleased with the refusal. Apparently, he told my senior analyst that as your husband, he had a right to understand what was being done with his money." I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. His money? The investment came entirely from my personal accounts. Accounts he didn't even know existed until recently. Elena's eyes widened slightly at this revelation, but she maintained her professional composure. "I thought it might be something like that. For what it's worth, I think most of us have figured out that there's more to this situation than a simple business transaction." "Is that creating problems for you or your team?" I asked, concerned that the personal aspects of the situation might be undermining workplace dynamics. "Quite the opposite, actually," Elena replied with a small smile. "James wasn't. Well, let's just say he wasn't known for his collaborative approach to leadership. Many of us find your style refreshing by comparison." This was the first direct criticism of James I'd heard from anyone at Meridian, and it confirmed suspicions I'd begun to form about his professional reputation. The image of the respected, beloved executive he had presented at home might be just as curated as the image of the financially naive wife he had presented at work. Over the following months, these suspicions continued to be validated as I worked more closely with the Meridian team. Behind the polished facade James had maintained was a history of taking credit for others' work, making unilateral decisions that overrode team input, and creating an environment where challenging his perspective was tantamount to career suicide. As these revelations accumulated, I found myself wondering how I had missed the connection between his behavior at home and his behavior at work. The patterns were identical. The careful control of information, the dismissal of others' expertise, the cultivation of dependency. He hadn't viewed me as a partner but as a subordinate, and apparently, he had approached his professional relationships with the same mindset. 6 months into my tenure as chairperson, the transformation at Meridian was palpable. The Phoenix 2.0 update had launched to rave reviews from clients. The product development pipeline was fuller and more innovative than it had been in years. Employee satisfaction scores had risen dramatically, particularly in departments that had reported directly to James. The Singapore office was performing adequately under James's leadership, neither exceeding expectations nor failing to meet them. His quarterly reports were thorough and professional, with none of the personal appeals that had characterized his earlier communications. It seemed he had accepted, if not embraced, our new professional relationship. Then came the email from Richard one evening as I was preparing to leave the office. "Need to speak with you urgently. Just received concerning information from Singapore." I found Richard in his office, his expression grave as he motioned for me to close the door behind me. "What's happened?" I asked, taking a seat across from him. One of our developers in Singapore discovered something unusual while updating the regional server security protocols, Richard began, sliding a folder across the desk. It appears James has been gathering proprietary information about our new enterprise platform, not just surface-level specs, but core architecture details, customer data, pricing structures. I leafed through the printouts, my stomach tightening, as I absorbed the implications. You think he's planning to leak this to a competitor? Worse, Richard said grimly. Based on his recent meetings and some discreet inquiries from industry contacts, I believe he's planning to start his own competing firm once he has enough of our intellectual property. The betrayal shouldn't have surprised me, given everything. I now knew about James, but somehow it still did. Not the act itself, but the calculated patience behind it. He had been quietly biding his time, playing the role of the cooperative ex while systematically preparing to undermine the company, and by extension me, in the most damaging way possible. Do we have enough evidence to terminate him? I asked, professional concerns momentarily overriding the personal shock. Yes, the legal team has confirmed the data access exceeds any legitimate business need. But there's a complication. Let me guess, I said, the pieces falling into place. Our biggest Singapore client is particularly attached to James. Richard nodded. Global Systems. They've made it clear that their relationship with Meridian is contingent on their comfort with our Singapore leadership. James has been cultivating their executive team extensively since his relocation. It was a classic James maneuver, creating leverage by making himself indispensable to key relationships. If we fired him, we risked losing our foothold in the Singapore market. If we didn't, we risked him walking away with enough proprietary information to become a serious competitive threat. What do you recommend? I asked, genuinely valuing Richard's insight on this delicate situation. Ordinarily, I'd say remove him immediately and deal with the client fallout, Richard replied thoughtfully. But given the personal complications and the potential for this to become a public relations issue if handled poorly, I think we need a more strategic approach. The personal complications. A delicate reference to the fact that James and I were still legally married. Our divorce proceeding slowly due to James's repeated delays and legal maneuvers. Any public confrontation between us would inevitably be framed through that personal lens, potentially undermining my leadership credibility just as I was solidifying it. I need to handle this myself, I said finally, reaching a decision. In person, not remotely. Richard looked surprised. You want to go to Singapore? Yes, officially to review the regional office operations, meet with key clients including Global Systems, and evaluate our expansion progress firsthand. I closed the folder containing the evidence of James's betrayal. Unofficially, to address this situation with the discretion it requires. The plan came together quickly over the next few days. I would travel to Singapore the following week, accompanied by Elena to review the financial operations and Marcus to assess the technical infrastructure. The official narrative was a routine executive review of our international expansion, with a particular focus on client relationships and regional growth opportunities. James's response to the announcement of our visit was a model of professional courtesy, with detailed itineraries proposed and meetings arranged. Nothing in his communications suggested he was aware that we had discovered his activities, or that my visit was anything other than standard corporate oversight. As I packed for the trip, I reflected on the irony of the situation. A year ago, James had been planning his escape to Southeast Asia, confident that I would remain behind, financially, devastated and emotionally broken. Now I was the one flying across the world, not as a desperate wife seeking reconciliation, but as the chairperson of the company he had once assumed would always recognize him as the superior talent. The woman who had once carefully hidden her success to protect her husband's ego was now preparing to protect her company from that same husband's betrayal, this time with the full force of her authority openly displayed. The circle was closing, but the story wasn't over. In Singapore, I would face James not just as his wife or his boss, but as the embodiment of everything he had underestimated and overlooked. The confrontation would require all the strength, strategy, and self-assurance I had developed over these transformative months. It was time to complete the reckoning that had begun the day he emptied our accounts, thinking it would be the end of my story rather than the beginning of my empire. The flight to Singapore stretched for nearly 18 hours, providing ample time for reflection. As the plane soared above the Pacific, I found myself reviewing not just the business strategy for the confrontation ahead, but the personal journey that had led me to this moment. A year ago, I would have been anxious about such a trip, carefully, planning how to present myself in a way that wouldn't overshadow James or trigger his insecurities. I would have packed outfits selected to look professional but not too authoritative, prepared to modulate my voice in meetings to avoid sounding too aggressive, his frequent criticism, and rehearsed ways to defer to his expertise even when I disagreed. Now my luggage contained power suits chosen because they made me feel confident. My briefcase held presentations that showcased my vision without apology. And my mind was focused not on managing James's ego, but on protecting the company I now led. "You seem surprisingly calm," Elena observed as she reviewed financial documents in the seat beside me. "I'd be furious if I were in your position." I considered her comment, realizing that anger wasn't actually what I felt. "It's not about fury," I explained. "It's about clarity. For years, I didn't see James clearly, or myself, for that matter. Now I do, and that knowledge is more powerful than anger could ever be." Elena nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense, though I might still be tempted to throw something at him when we get there." We shared a laugh, the kind of natural camaraderie that had been developing between us over the past months. It struck me how different this professional relationship was from any I'd had before, equal, respectful, without the constant self-editing I'd grown accustomed to in James's presence. "Can I ask you something personal?" Elena ventured after a moment. "You can ask," I replied with a smile. "I might not answer." "Fair enough," she acknowledged. "I've just been wondering, how did you do it? Build this whole separate financial life without him knowing? Practically speaking, I mean." It was a question I'd been asked several times since taking over Meridian, usually with a subtext of suspicion or judgment. But Elena's tone carried only genuine curiosity and perhaps a note of admiration. "It started small," I told her, deciding transparency was appropriate with someone who had proven herself trustworthy. "When I first launched my design business, James assumed it was a hobby that might bring in occasional spending money. He never asked to see the contracts or the payments, so I opened a separate business account." I paused, remembering that first small act of financial independence, how empowering it had felt to have resources that were wholly mine. As the business grew, I kept reinvesting most of the profits rather than transferring them to our joint accounts. I started working with Melissa, my financial advisor, to build investments that James wouldn't see or need to sign off on. "Wasn't that, I don't know, deceptive?" Elena asked, though her tone remained free of judgment. "In retrospect, yes," I admitted. "But it wasn't planned as deception initially. It was more like creating a space where I didn't have to justify or explain myself, where my decisions weren't subject to his approval or criticism. I thought about how to explain the gradual evolution of my separate financial life in a way that someone who hadn't experienced such a relationship might understand. Imagine you're an accomplished pianist, I said finally, but every time you play, someone stands over you pointing out minor flaws and suggesting improvements to your technique. Eventually, you might start practicing in private, not to hide your playing, but to reconnect with the joy of it without constant criticism. Ha! Elena nodded slowly. And then one day, you're playing Carnegie Hall while they're still thinking you just tinker on the keys occasionally. Exactly, I smiled, appreciating her quick understanding. The secrecy wasn't the goal. It was just a necessary condition for growth in an environment that would have stifled it otherwise. Our conversation drifted to other topics as the flight continued, but Elena's questions had served as valuable preparation for what awaited me in Singapore. Not just the confrontation with James, but the inevitable scrutiny of our unusual situation from clients, employees, and eventually, the broader business world. Singapore greeted us with its characteristic efficiency and gleaming modernity. A company car whisked us from Changi Airport to the luxurious hotel where James had arranged accommodations for the executive team. Despite my explicit instructions for a standard business visit, he had booked lavish suites with panoramic views of the city skyline, a subtle attempt to position himself as the gracious host rather than the subordinate being reviewed. Impressive, Marcus commented as we checked in, clearly appreciating the 5-star surroundings. The Singapore office must be performing even better than the reports indicate if they can afford this level of executive hosting. Actually, I replied, maintaining a pleasant expression for the benefit of the hotel staff, this wasn't authorized in the travel budget I approved. Please make a note, Elena. We'll need to address the expenditure discrepancy in our financial review. It was a small assertion of authority, but an important one. James needed to understand that charm and grand gestures wouldn't distract me from holding him accountable to the same standards as any other regional director. We had arranged to begin our visit with a tour of the Singapore office the following morning, giving us time to recover from the journey and prepare for what promised to be a challenging few days. That evening, as I was reviewing our itinerary, my phone lit up with a text from James. Victoria, I've made dinner reservations at John for 8 p.m. Thought we might discuss the visit privately before tomorrow's official proceedings. The car will pick you up at 7:30. Another presumption, another attempt to establish control of the narrative by moving our first interaction to a setting of his choosing. An exclusive restaurant where social conventions would constrain my ability to address his misconduct directly. The James of old would have expected me to acquiesce to this plan without question, flattered by his attention and unwilling to create conflict. I texted back a simple response. Thank you for the thought, but I've already made arrangements with Elena and Marcus to review tomorrow's agenda over dinner at the hotel. See you at the office at 9 a.m. Then I muted notifications from his number and continued with my preparation. The Singapore office of Meridian Technologies occupied 3 floors of a sleek high-rise in the financial district. As our car approached the building the next morning, I felt a momentary flutter of nerves. Not about confronting James, but about how I would be perceived by the employees here who knew me only as the boss's wife, who had somehow become their ultimate superior. Remember, Richard had advised before our departure, first impressions will set the tone for everything that follows. The Singapore team will be looking for any sign of personal drama or emotional decision-making to confirm the narrative James has likely been feeding them. As we stepped off the elevator into the reception area, James was waiting with a carefully composed smile and a small, welcoming committee of senior staff. He had dressed impeccably in a tailored suit that I recognized as new, probably purchased specifically to impress during this visit. "Victoria," he greeted me with a professional nod, no trace of personal familiarity in his tone. "Welcome to Meridian, Singapore. We're honored to have the executive team visit our operations." "Thank you, James," I replied, matching his formal demeanor. "We're looking forward to a comprehensive review of the regional performance." The subtle tension in the air was palpable as the staff watched our interaction, clearly aware of our personal connection despite the professional veneer. I made a point of greeting each team member individually, asking specific questions about their roles and contributions, establishing myself as thorough and engaged rather than a figurehead, making a ceremonial appearance. The office tour was meticulously orchestrated, with James highlighting the rapid growth of the Singapore operation and the prestigious clients they had secured under his leadership. It was an impressive showing, I had to admit. Whatever his personal failings or ulterior motives, James was undeniably skilled at creating the appearance of success. "And this is our secure development environment," James explained as we entered a restricted area where engineers were working on adaptations of Meridian's core products for the Asian market. "We've implemented specialized protocols to protect our intellectual property while allowing the customization needed for regional clients." This was the heart of the matter, the environment where, according to our investigation, James had been systematically collecting proprietary information for his planned competitive venture. Looking around at the dedicated developers who had no idea their work was potentially being compromised, I felt a renewed resolve to handle the situation decisively but discreetly. "I'd like to review the security protocols in detail," I said, turning to Marcus. "Perhaps after lunch, you and the head of engineering could walk me through the specific measures in place." James's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'd be happy to cover that personally. Security has been one of my priority areas." "I'm sure it has," I replied, my tone pleasant but firm. "However, Marcus specializes in technical security architecture. I'd like his assessment of the current systems." It was a small block in the ongoing chess match between us, preventing James from controlling access to the very evidence of his misconduct. The flash of calculation in his eyes told me he understood exactly what was happening. The morning continued, with presentations from each department head, followed by a lunch with the entire Singapore staff. I made a point of circulating among the employees rather than remaining at the executive table, asking questions and expressing genuine interest in their perspectives on the company's regional growth. By early afternoon, I had accomplished two critical objectives: establishing direct relationships with key personnel independent of James's mediation, and signaling to the entire office that my visit was substantive rather than ceremonial. At the sea, groundwork was laid for what would come next. "I'd like to meet with you privately now," I told James as the scheduled activities concluded. "Let's use your office." He led me to an impressive corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Singapore skyline, a space clearly designed to project power and success. Photographs of James with various dignitaries and business leaders lined one wall, creating a visual narrative of his importance. I noticed that among the many pictures, there wasn't a single one of me or of us together. I waited until the door closed behind us before speaking, my tone measured and direct. "We have a problem, James." "Oh?" he replied, the picture of innocence, as he took a seat behind his imposing desk. The metrics all show we're exceeding growth targets. Global Systems just renewed their contract at an increased service level. What problem could there possibly be? I placed a flash drive on his desk, the one containing copies of the evidence we had gathered. This is the problem. We have documented proof that you've been systematically collecting proprietary information beyond your authorized access level. Information that would be extremely valuable to a competitor, or to someone planning to become a competitor. The practiced charm vanished from his expression, replaced by a cold calculation I had seen only glimpses of during our marriage. That's a serious accusation, Victoria. One that would be difficult to prove and potentially embarrassing for Meridian if made public, especially given our personal situation. There it was, the implied threat I had anticipated. Any move against him would be framed as a vindictive wife using her position for personal vengeance, potentially damaging Meridian's reputation and my leadership credibility. It's not an accusation, I replied calmly. It's a factual observation backed by digital records, access logs, and witness statements. The legal team has already confirmed it constitutes clear violation of your employment contract and our intellectual property protections. I let that sink in before continuing. As for our personal situation, yes, it complicates matters, which is why I'm here having this conversation privately instead of having security escort you from the building, as would be standard protocol in such cases. James's expression hardened. The mask of professional courtesy completely dropped now that we were alone. What exactly do you want, Victoria? To fire me? To humiliate me? Haven't you already taken enough? The victim narrative was so predictable it almost made me smile. In James's worldview, he was always the protagonist, even when caught in blatant wrongdoing. What I want, I said evenly, is to protect Meridian Technologies, a company that employs hundreds of people who depend on its success for their livelihoods. People who have done nothing to deserve being caught in the crossfire of your revenge fantasies. I leaned forward, meeting his gaze directly. So here's what's going to happen. You will resign as regional director, effective immediately, citing personal reasons. You will transfer all company information in your possession, delete any copies, and sign an enhanced non-compete agreement that our legal team has prepared. In return, there will be no legal action regarding the information you've already accessed inappropriately. The color rose in his face, anger warring with the recognition that his options were limited. And if I refuse? If I tell Global Systems and the other major clients that Meridian is pushing me out because the new chairperson happens to be my soon-to-be ex-wife? How do you think that will play in the business press? It was exactly the scenario Richard and I had discussed, the nuclear option that James thought would protect him from consequences. What he didn't know was that I had already neutralized this threat. Before flying here, I told him, I personally contacted the CEO of Global Systems. We had a very candid conversation about both the leadership transition at Meridian and certain irregularities that had been identified in the Singapore operation. James's expression froze, the confidence draining from his features as I continued. Interestingly, he was quite understanding. It seems they've had their own concerns about data security in recent collaborations, though they couldn't pinpoint the source. When I suggested a joint audit of all shared systems as a precautionary measure, he was extremely supportive. I stood up, no longer needing to lean in to command attention. The narrative you're threatening to create has already been preempted, James. The clients know. The board knows. The only people who don't know are the staff out there who still respect you, and I'm offering you the chance to leave with that respect intact, rather than being escorted out under a cloud of legal accusations. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of final realizations. James had always excelled at calculating angles and leveraging relationships, but he had fatally miscalculated this time. The woman he had dismissed as financially naive and professionally inconsequential had outmaneuvered him completely. "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" he finally said, a curious mix of bitterness and reluctant admiration in his tone. "I learned from the best," I replied simply. The practical details of James's departure were handled with the same efficiency that characterized everything about Singapore. By that evening, he had signed the resignation letter and all associated legal documents. A company-wide email announced that he was stepping down to pursue other opportunities, with Elena temporarily assuming leadership of the regional office until a permanent replacement could be appointed. I had expected to feel triumph in this moment, the satisfying conclusion to a year-long journey from betrayed wife to vindicated executive. Instead, what I felt was a complex mix of relief, sadness for what might have been, and most surprisingly, gratitude for the path that had led me here. As I prepared for our final interaction, a brief handover meeting scheduled for the following morning, I found myself reflecting on the strange symmetry of our situation. A year ago, James had sat across from me at our dining table, fabricating a story about a consulting opportunity to conceal his plans to empty our accounts and disappear. Now I sat in a hotel room on the other side of the world, orchestrating his professional exit with the same careful attention to narrative. The difference, I realized, was not in the calculated nature of our actions, but in their purpose. James had acted to benefit himself at my expense. I was acting to protect a company and its people, including James himself, from the consequences of his destructive choices. The handover meeting was brief and subdued. James provided the necessary passwords and access information, outlined pending client issues, and recommended staff for potential promotion. His performance was flawless, professional, thorough, with no hint of the anger or resentment I knew he must be feeling. As the meeting concluded and he prepared to leave Meridian's Singapore office for the last time, he paused at the door. "There's something I've been wondering," he said, turning back to face me. "That day at the bank, when you discovered the transfer, you moved remarkably quickly to secure control of Meridian, almost as if you'd been preparing for that moment. It wasn't quite a question, but the implication was clear. Had I been planning this all along, waiting for him to make a mistake that would justify my takeover? I wasn't preparing to take over Meridian specifically, I answered honestly. But I was preparing for independence. There's a difference between planning for your own freedom and planning for someone else's downfall. He seemed to consider this, his expression unreadable. "You know, in a strange way, I'm almost proud. The Victoria I married would never have had the confidence to do any of this." "The Victoria you married was always capable," I corrected him gently. "She just didn't believe it yet. You didn't create me, James. You just underestimated me. There's a difference there, too." He nodded slowly, absorbing this perspective. "For what it's worth, I did love you, in my way." "I know," I replied, and found that I meant it. "Your way just wasn't enough for either of us." And with that, James Bennett walked out of Meridian Technologies and out of my professional life. The divorce proceedings, which had been dragging on through his delaying tactics, concluded quietly within a month of his resignation. The settlement was surprisingly straightforward once the leverage of his position at Meridian was removed from the equation. The story of his departure eventually made its way through industry circles, but the narrative that emerged was one of professional transition rather than personal drama. My careful groundwork with clients and the board had ensured that the focus remained on Meridian's continued growth and innovation rather than the unusual circumstances of its leadership change. In the years since that confrontation in Singapore, Meridian has expanded its operations throughout Asia, with new offices in Tokyo and Seoul. The proprietary information James had been gathering never made its way to competitors, and his plans for a rival venture apparently dissolved with his departure from the company. As for me, the journey from underestimated spouse to respected chairperson continues to shape every aspect of my leadership. When young professionals, particularly women, ask for my advice, I share not just the triumphs, but the difficult lessons learned along the way. Build your skills quietly if you must, I tell them, but never doubt their value. Create financial independence even when it seems unnecessary, especially then. And always remember that the people who underestimate you are giving you their greatest weakness, not identifying yours. Perhaps the most meaningful outcome of this entire experience has been the Women's Financial Independence Initiative that I launched using a portion of my personal Meridian dividends. The program provides resources, education, and seed funding for women trapped in financially controlling relationships, helping them build the skills and savings needed to reclaim their autonomy. At our most recent fundraising gala, a woman approached me with tears in her eyes. "Your story saved my life," she said simply. "I was about to give up on ever escaping my situation when I heard you speak about secret investments and emergency funds. Now I'm 6 months away from having enough to start over." In that moment, I understood that my journey wasn't just about personal vindication or professional success. It was about breaking a cycle that traps countless talented individuals in diminished lives and showing them a path to their own empowerment. The company that James tried to drain our accounts to escape from has become a platform for transformation that extends far beyond balance sheets and quarterly reports. And the wife he assumed would be left helpless without him has discovered that her greatest strength was there all along, waiting for the courage to claim it. Sometimes I think about that moment in the bank when everything changed, when the foundation of my carefully constructed life crumbled beneath me. What had seemed like an ending was actually the first step toward becoming the person I was always meant to be. The accounts James emptied were refilled many times over. The confidence he undermined grew stronger through testing. And the woman he underestimated now leads the company his boss proudly calls mine. 3 years have passed since that pivotal moment in Singapore. 3 years of transformation, growth, and unexpected discoveries that have shaped not just Meridian Technologies, but my understanding of strength, leadership, and purpose. The quarterly board meeting had just concluded, and as the executives filed out of the conference room, Richard lingered behind. Now serving as vice chairman while gradually transitioning toward retirement, he had become both mentor and friend. Through the tumultuous journey we had navigated together, 5 consecutive quarters of record growth, he noted, gathering his papers with a satisfied smile. The Jenkins acquisition is already showing better returns than projected, and the new product line is generating significant buzz in the industry. "You've built something remarkable here, Victoria." "We've built it together," I corrected him, though I accepted the compliment with a confidence that would have been foreign to me in my previous life. "The team has been extraordinary." Richard studied me for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "You know, when I agreed to sell you controlling interest in Meridian, I believed in your business acumen, but I had no idea you would transform the company so completely. Change was necessary, I replied, thinking of how stagnant Meridian had become in its comfortable success before I took the helm. Comfortable companies rarely reach their full potential. Much like comfortable people, Richard observed with the perceptiveness that had made him a successful entrepreneur long before I entered the picture. The observation struck a chord. My own comfortable existence as James's wife, financially secure but professionally diminished, had been a form of stagnation that I had accepted for far too long. It had taken catastrophic betrayal to shake me out of that complacency and into the realization of my true capabilities. As we walked toward the executive elevator, Richard asked about the upcoming Women in Leadership Summit where I was scheduled to deliver the keynote address. Have you finished your speech? The communications team has been buzzing about it for weeks. I smiled, thinking of the draft I had been refining late into previous nights. Almost. It's turning out to be more personal than I initially intended. Those are always the most impactful, he remarked. People connect with authenticity more than polished corporate messaging. The summit had become one of the most anticipated events on the business calendar, drawing female executives and aspiring leaders from across industries. What had begun as a modest gathering in Meridian's conference room had grown into a prestigious event hosted at the Grand Convention Center, with waiting lists for attendance despite the expanded capacity. My journey from underestimated spouse to respected CEO had struck a powerful chord, particularly among women navigating male-dominated industries. The keynote would be my opportunity to share not just the triumph of professional success, but the deeper lessons about self-worth, resilience, and authentic leadership that had emerged from my experience. Back in my office, I found Elena waiting, with the quarterly results from our newest international office. Since her exceptional management of the Singapore transition, she had risen to become Chief Operating Officer, bringing a strategic vision and operational excellence that complemented my own leadership style. Tokyo is exceeding all projections, she reported, her pride evident as she handed me the detailed analysis. The cultural adaptations Marcus implemented in the software have given us a significant advantage over competitors trying to enter the market with standardized products. Excellent, I replied, scanning the impressive figures. And how is Hiroshi adjusting to the regional director role? Remarkably well. The local team respects his technical expertise, and he's been surprisingly adept at client relationships, for someone who spent most of his career in development. We discussed operational details for several minutes before Elena shifted to a more personal topic. Have you seen the profile in Business Innovators yet? It hit newsstands this morning. I shook my head, having been absorbed in board preparations since dawn. Is it as terrifying as having a photographer follow me around for 2 days led me to believe it would be? Elena laughed, producing a glossy magazine from her portfolio. Judge for yourself. Though fair warning, they titled it The Phoenix of Meridian, How Victoria Bennett Rose from the Ashes of Betrayal to Build a Tech Empire. I groaned at the dramatic framing, taking the magazine reluctantly. The cover featured a professional portrait of me standing confidently at Meridian's headquarters, the city skyline visible through the glass walls behind me. The photographer had captured an expression of calm determination that I had come to recognize as my natural leadership demeanor, so different from the carefully constructed pleasantness I had maintained during my marriage. The article itself is actually quite good, Elena assured me. Once you get past the sensationalized intro, they focused primarily on your strategic vision for Meridian and the innovations you've championed. The personal angle is there, but it's not the main focus. I appreciated that. While I had come to accept that my unusual path to corporate leadership would always color public perception, I preferred to be evaluated on results rather than narrative. Meridian's performance under my chairmanship spoke volumes more than any personal saga could. "Oh, and there's one more thing," Elena added, her tone shifting slightly. "James reached out through his attorney yesterday. He's requesting a meeting." The name still triggered a complex emotional response. Not pain anymore, but a heightened awareness, like a scar that remains sensitive to touch long after healing. In the 3 years since his departure from Meridian, James had maintained minimal contact, communicating only through lawyers regarding the final details of our divorce, settlement, and his severance package. "Did he indicate what this is about?" I asked, curious despite myself. "Not specifically. The message just said he'd like to discuss a matter of mutual interest and potential benefit." Elena's skeptical expression matched my own instinctive wariness. "I told his attorney you're booked solid through the summit next week, but could potentially meet after that if the matter is urgent." I considered declining outright. There was no legal or business obligation to engage with James at this point. Yet something about the unusual request piqued my curiosity. What possible mutual interest could remain between us after such a definitive separation, both personal and professional? Schedule it for after the summit, I decided. But at a neutral location, not here at Meridian. Elena nodded, making a note in her tablet. "I'll arrange it. And Victoria, do you want someone else present?" "I'd be happy to attend as a buffer." The offer was thoughtful and typical of the protective instinct Elena had developed toward me, despite being several years my junior. "Thank you, but I'll handle it alone. Whatever James wants after all this time, I'm certainly not vulnerable to his manipulation anymore." After Elena departed, I turned my attention back to the summit preparation, reviewing the latest registration numbers and agenda details. The event had grown to include specialized workshops on financial independence, mentorship programs for emerging female leaders, and networking opportunities designed to break through the isolation many women experienced in executive roles. What had begun as my personal story had evolved into a movement of sorts, one focused not just on individual achievement, but on systemic change and collective empowerment. The Women's Financial Independence Initiative that I had founded had now assisted over 500 women in establishing economic security separate from controlling relationships, with many going on to launch successful businesses or advance in corporate careers. As evening fell and the office gradually emptied, I remained at my desk, returning to the draft of my keynote speech. The words on the screen represented my attempt to distill 3 years of intense learning and growth into 30 minutes of meaningful guidance for others on similar journeys. "True strength," I had written, "isn't measured by how well you perform when everything is going according to plan. It's revealed in those moments when every plan has failed, when the foundations you built your life upon have crumbled beneath you. In those moments of freefall, you discover capacities within yourself that comfort and security would never have allowed you to recognize." The truth of those words resonated deeply as I reflected on my own freefall moment. That day when James's betrayal had shattered the carefully constructed reality of our marriage. Had he not attempted to drain our accounts and escape? Would I ever have claimed my full potential? Would I have continued indefinitely in that half-life of hidden achievement and deliberate diminishment? I couldn't know for certain. But I did know that the crisis that had seemed like devastation had instead been liberation. Painful, certainly, but ultimately transformative in ways I could never have anticipated. A notification on my phone interrupted these reflections, a reminder about tomorrow's interview with Forbes Women on emerging leadership models in technology firms. Another opportunity to shape the conversation around women in business, and perhaps inspire others standing at their own crossroads of crisis and possibility. The week of the summit passed in a whirlwind of activity. Over 2,000 attendees filled the Grand Convention Center, creating an energy that was palpable from the moment the doors opened. Women at various stages of their professional journeys, from recent graduates to seasoned executives, connected across industry lines, sharing experiences and strategies that transcended specific business contexts. My keynote address, delivered to a packed auditorium on the final day, became a moment of profound connection rather than simple presentation. As I shared the unvarnished truth of my journey, the gradual erosion of self-confidence within my marriage, the secret building of financial resources as an act of self-preservation, and ultimately the reclamation of my professional identity after betrayal, I could see recognition in countless faces. The most dangerous chains are the ones we don't recognize we're wearing, I told the attentive audience. The subtle beliefs that limit what we imagine for ourselves, the accommodations we make to keep peace at the expense of our potential, the gradual acceptance of being underestimated until we begin to underestimate ourselves. I moved away from the podium, choosing to speak more directly without the barrier of formality. I'm often asked if I'm angry about the years I spent hiding my capabilities, playing small to maintain a relationship that ultimately proved unworthy of such sacrifice. The honest answer is that I'm not angry. I'm determined. Determined that what I experienced becomes less common with each passing generation. Determined that the women in this room never feel they must choose between personal fulfillment and professional achievement. The standing ovation that followed was humbling, but even more meaningful were the conversations afterward. Dozens of women sharing their own stories of constraint and liberation, of talents hidden and finally expressed, of financial dependence, carefully transformed into economic autonomy. One young executive from a manufacturing firm approached me with tears in her eyes. "I've been keeping my promotion secret from my husband for 6 months," she confessed, "because his fragile ego couldn't handle me out-earning him. After hearing your speech, I'm going home to have the conversation I've been avoiding. If he can't celebrate my success, he doesn't deserve to share my life." Another woman, older and more established in her career, shared how she had been secretly funding her sister's escape from a financially abusive marriage. "Your foundation's resources have been invaluable," she told me. "She's finally building savings he can't access and developing skills that will make her employable when she's ready to leave." These interactions reinforced what I had come to believe deeply, that financial independence wasn't just about money, it was about agency, dignity, and the freedom to make authentic choices rather than decisions constrained by economic vulnerability. The day after the summit concluded, I found myself sitting in a private dining room at the Westerly, a discreet restaurant known for catering to business executives seeking conversation without interruption. The neutral territory I had selected for my meeting with James. He arrived precisely on time, dressed in the impeccable business attire that had always been his armor. 3 years had added subtle silver at his temples and fine lines around his eyes, but otherwise, he appeared much as he had when we parted in Singapore, polished, confident, projecting success regardless of the reality beneath. "Victoria," he greeted me, extending his hand formally. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." "James," I replied, accepting the handshake briefly before gesturing to the chair across from mine. Your message indicated a matter of mutual interest? He settled into his seat, declining the offered wine in favor of sparkling water. I noticed this departure from his usual preference for expensive Cabernets, but made no comment. "You're looking well," he observed, "though that's hardly surprising given Meridian's performance under your leadership. The business press can't seem to publish enough glowing profiles." "Thank you," I replied simply, neither rejecting the compliment nor engaging with the implied criticism about media attention. "But I assume you didn't request this meeting to discuss my press coverage." James smiled slightly, acknowledging my redirection. "Direct as always. You're right, of course." He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a slim folder. "I've been developing a new financial technology platform focused on helping women achieve economic independence, particularly those in controlling or abusive relationships." This was perhaps the last thing I had expected from James, and my surprise must have shown on my face. "Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us."